I would like to introduce you our speaker, Zheng. Zheng holds a master degree in environmental studies in planning from York University. She completed her Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and English Literature at University of Toronto. She's also a first-generation immigrant from a Chinese city called Fuzhou, and she grew up in North York with minimum interactions with downtown Chinatown. However, throughout her undergraduate and graduate student life, she lived next to Toronto's Chinatown. She witnessed the evolution of this space while the student population at U of T was increasing rapidly. This presentation is drawn from her master thesis project. Her perspective is informed through her community involvement and her own lived experiences of trying to find appropriate and affordable student housing in the city of Toronto. Currently, she works at ERA Architects as an urban planner on a range of heritage conservation and planning projects. Carol, thank you so much for giving us this opportunity to learn about your work.
Thank you so much, Tracy, for the wonderful and warm welcome. My name is Corals, and I'll be presenting on Searching for an Authentic Chinatown, Studentification, Intangible Heritage, and Contentious Space. So the aim of this presentation is really to look at how students and neighborhood change in Toronto's Chinatown is occurring and the implications of both ongoing house conversions and new developments as well are taking place in the space, as well as neighborhood politics in response to changes. In addition to all of the thank yous that Tracy gave, I also want to thank the York Center for Asian Research, YCAR, for hosting this event, and for the Canada-China Initiatives Fund, which funded the field work for this research, interviewee honorariums, as well as the research assistant, Sonia Dobson, who helped transcribe all of the interviews. I also want to thank MyTax, in which the Research Trainee Award funded much of the initial research, and the City Institute for co-hosting this event. I also want to thank Dr. Luisa Sotomayor, who is my advisor, and a co-author on a paper to be published in housing policy debates, as well as the use of her student LTO project. So my positionality, as Dr. Zhang mentions, is that I'm a first-generation immigrant who immigrated from mainland China and grew up in North York. So my perspective on the space is going to be very different from one that's lived in it for generations. And I also want to emphasize that very early on, because everything I'm going to present thereof after is really a series of stories that I've weaved together from archival documents as well as various academic sources, and that these and everything else are a series of narratives I'm constructing about this space. So I want to begin this presentation with this quote from a Chinese-Canadian activist with Friends of Chinatown, Toronto. The quote reads, "But do the international students have any understandings of this Chinatown? Because this Chinatown was the only place where Chinese people could exist on a legislative policy level. Like Chinese people weren't allowed to go into certain public spaces or vote, but Chinese international students coming over, it's like, well, everyone's Chinese where they're coming from." And the aim of this quote is really to emphasize the cleavages between new and existing diaspora communities and how they see the other. I also want to note here that there are many centers of the Chinese diaspora throughout the city of Toronto, and the space that we'll be talking about today, and you can see on the image on the right here, is Chinatown West, situated at Spadina and Dundas. So this is a view of Spadina Avenue within the Chinatown commercial study area looking south. It gives you a sense of the types of buildings within this space. On the right here, you see a newly constructed condominium complex, but you also see remnants of its former uses, the warehouse buildings that characterize this area's history as part of the garment district, as well as low-rise commercial buildings. It also gives you a sense of the various aesthetics and uses within this space. As well, you can note that Spadina Avenue is a major transit corridor and situated in the downtown adjacent to a number of universities. So on the right here, on the left here, you have an aerial photograph of the site as seen from above. The area outlined in white is a residential study area, and it spans a space of 1.3 square kilometers. And you can see from the image that this area is characterized by its 19th century street patterns, as well as its institutional uses. So the complex on the upper right corner is the Toronto Western Hospital, and the green space to the bottom left corner is Alexandra Park, which is a major social housing complex. I've also annotated Spadina Avenue and Dundas Street within the commercial study area. Spadina Avenue within the context of the study is approximately 900 meters, and Dundas Street is approximately 600 meters. In the image on the right is what this space looks like on the ground. You can see that the buildings are a majority Victorian or Edwardian in age, and they are low-rise. However, interestingly enough, so this image was actually taken from my previous apartment within the space. All of the buildings that you can see are actually subdivided into rental apartments, mostly targeting students. So the aims of this project is really looking at these three central research questions. One, how do growing urban universities adjacent to Chinatowns transform them? Second, what are the differences between traditional and new forms of studentification occurring concurrently in Chinatown, which some of the terms I'll go into detail more on later, as well as what types of neighborhood tensions emerge as a result of co-ethnic studentification. So the diagram on the right here shows the same image you saw earlier, outlined though with three different major universities. So the University of Toronto, shown in blue, has three different campuses, but what we annotated here is the largest in terms of student population, and it's located just north of the residential study area. We have Ryerson University, now known as X University, as well as the Ontario College of Arts and Design University, or OCAD University. So our research draws upon multiple data sources. So I'm very thankful to have used the Student Dwell TO project, which spanned from 2018 and 2020, that looked at student densities and draw the qualitative data from that project. Second, this presentation builds upon my Master's of Environmental Thesis project, which itself was drawn from observation research from living within this space throughout my academic career, as well as interviews with Chinatown stakeholders and spatial analysis drawn from Google Street View. And finally, we build upon a 2019 survey of young people who visited Chinatown. And this is thanks to Dr. Erica Allen Kim at the University of Toronto Daniels faculty. And this survey had a sample size of approximately 200 mostly young people. So the overarching question, I guess, for this presentation is that, well, Chinatown is gentrifying, as you can see from all of these news articles. But how exactly is that happening? Well, if we define gentrification as a process of displacement, we can see that three forms of gentrification is happening. So on the first here, is the renovation of the space. So these two are actually the same buildings. The image on the left is this building as seen in 2015, and the image on the right is this building as seen in 2019. And this is the renovation of the Xinguang Center. And the renovation process displays a number of clothing retailers that you can see on the ground level, as well as a restaurant within the space. And the newly renovated building has been empty for 3 years, sitting in the space, and it was only recently leased out. The second form of gentrification we can see is redevelopment. So on the left is what's existing in the space. It's a series of split level commercial spaces that are low rise in nature and houses many businesses within its commercial spaces, and it will be redeveloped into a mid-rise purpose-built rental building with commercial spaces at grade that you can see on the right here. And the third, and I think more covert form of gentrification is in which the aesthetics and uses are largely the same. However, they're no longer independently owned. So the image on the left here, is a shot of the space in 2007, showing 3 different independently owned restaurant establishments. But the image on the right here is the same series of buildings. However, all of the uses have been replaced by international Chinese chains and franchises. So the Coco, the Tanfen Place, and Iron Rooster. And before I go into the findings, I think it's really important to go over the history of Chinese in Canada, as well as the history of the Chinatown we're speaking of, to really set context for the affect that governs the space, as well as how history plays an important role in current discussions of preservation and defining who are the appropriate quote, quote, users of this space. So in 1871, British Columbia joined the Confederation on the promise of a railway that connected Eastern Canada to the new Western provinces to be built within 10 years. Andrew Onderdonk, an American contractor hired by the Canadian government to oversee the building of the railway, estimated that a workforce of 10,000 laborers would be needed, but only 400 local laborers were available and could be found. So 17,000 Chinese laborers were hired, mostly from rural villages in Guangdong province, who sold their possessions to pay for ship fare, and recruits composed of boys as young as 12 to 40-year-old men. And they formed bachelor societies and settlements along the tracks of the railway. And the Chinese laborers were tasked with the most dangerous aspects of the railway construction, such as blowing through entire mountainsides. And while official death estimates at least 600 died in construction, it's believed that roughly 1 Chinese person died for every mile of track laid. And at the same period of time as the Pacific Railway, we had the Chinese Immigration Act of 1885, which was the only immigration policy to exclude an ethnic group by name, and it levied a tax of $50 that grew to $500, which is approximately the wage of a 2-year salary for a railway worker. The Canadian state collected $23 million in head tax, which was nearly the same amount of money to pay for the western portion of the railway. So in essence, the Chinese built and then reimbursed the Canadian state for the construction of the railway. Following the head tax era, we had the Chinese Exclusion Act, which spanned from 1923 to 1947, which banned the outright complete immigration of Chinese into Canada, and it was only repealed following activism in World War II in 1947. And it was in 1947 that Chinese people within the state for the first time gained the right to vote both federally and provincially. And I really like this image on the right of John Chow, who came to Canada in 1922, who holds up his head tax, showing that he paid the $500 and proudly ripping it. And I also want to examine the language surrounding the Chinese in the early periods of this country's history, specifically in 2 points. So 1, during the construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway, the Chinese laborers were seen mostly as guest workers from China. They were defined as a sojourner whose intentions were to earn money and return to China. And this is the second point is an excerpt from a Maclean's article in 1922. And it reads, "It behooves the people in Canada and the United States to consider the desirability of these visitors, for they are visitors, and to say whether or not we shall be at home with them for the future." And this, I think, really shows the perception of them as temporary, transient, but also not belonging in this white settler state. The second is narratives and associations of Chinatown and the Chinese with drug use, as well as other forms of crime and just general vice. So this is an excerpt from the Jack Canuck in 1911, which reads, "There are no less than 25 Chinese stores, laundries, and restaurants in the blocks bounded by King, Queen, Yonge, and York Streets. How many of them are dens? One only needs to stroll through the above-mentioned blocks and notice the throngs of Chinese lounging in the streets and doorways to realize that yellow peril is more than the mere word in this city." And speaking of the city, let's talk about Chinatowns in Toronto. So the first recognized Chinatown was located in the St. John's Ward, or the Ward, and it was centered at Elizabeth and Dundas Street. And in the late 1940s, the city of Toronto expropriated a large portion of the lands within the ward for the construction of what we now know as City Hall. And following the construction of this new $30 million complex, additional discussions were underway on what remains of the first Chinatown adjacent to this now shiny new civic building and whether or not they're appropriate for this space. And due to the kind of expropriation fears, a large number of Chinese businesses moved outside of the first Chinatown into the northern suburbs, as well as westwards along Dundas Street, and settling eventually at Spadina and Dundas, which was a former Jewish community, over further expropriation fears. And it wasn't until the late 1970s that what we now call Chinatown West emerged as the new, quote, Chinatown. And this space was largely built by actually transnational Hong Kong capital in the 1970s and 80s. So two major mall developments marked this space: Chinatown Center and Dragon City Mall, both of which were built from Hong Kong money from these two separate developer brother duos from Hong Kong. And the format, tenure, and architectural style of these spaces were directly imported from Hong Kong. And beyond that, in the same period, we also had the arrival of Vietnamese refugees in the 1970s. And these were ethnic Chinese Vietnamese people who had specific language skills and ability to tap into the existing networks of Chinatown. And in this article by Fan and Luck 2005, described the period after this as the increased Vietnamization of Chinatown West, creating what we see now today as a unique mix of both Chinese and Vietnamese and other Pan-Asian businesses along the strip. And in the 1990s, we had narratives of crime dominating the space, specifically looking at the Vietnamese street gangs. And what about the current period? Well, I'm skipping quite a lot, but I'm defining the current period now in the last 10 or so years as really dominated by students and the student question. And what I mean by that is there is an extreme shortage of on-campus housing, i.e. university provided housing in this space. So recall the three institutions that I pointed out earlier. There is a 92.7% unmet demand of students housed. So assuming even that only half of this 100,000 plus population of students want to live adjacent to their universities, like that's still 50,000 students. Where exactly are they living? Like this area is just like 1.5 square kilometers. Like where, I can't seem to understand this like number. And we also want to situate our findings within already existing key debates. So I've thrown this term around a lot, studentification. So when we're talking about studentification, we're talking about both horizontal and vertical studentification, in which grooming house conversion processes define studentification's first horizontal wave. And this refers to both the gentrification and degradation of surrounding residential areas by predominantly student populations. And this can be seen very overtly in many rural universities and their campuses, as well as debates over studentification's vertical second wave that are aimed to describe the socioeconomic patterns occurring in high-rise student housing concentrated in compact footprints, either on or off campus in privately built student accommodations or in the private rental markets. We also situate our findings within the global industry of higher education and the expansion of student populations and the recruitment and proliferation of undergraduate international students, more on this later, as well as, I think really interestingly, the formation of co-ethnic diasporas, in which we examine how the growing intake of international students, particularly from China, living in proximity to Chinatown, creates diverse class-based tensions and reactions to co-ethnic neighborhood change amongst residents and stakeholders within the same diaspora community. And finally, we situate ourselves within the neoliberal urbanization regime in the city. So Toronto's Chinatown is at an inflection point owing to the changing geography of immigration in the Toronto and the return to the city movement spurred by municipal policies adopted since the 1990s. And what we mean by the expansion of higher education sector and institutions is that since the 1990s, government funding, which was how universities were mostly funded by, has been steadily decreasing over the years. So in 1992, 83% of universities' operating funding was government income. However, in 2013, this percentage has shrunk to less than 50%. And within the same period, to make up for the shortfall of government funding, we had the rise of public-private partnerships, as you can see in gray here, as well as a dependence on international students as a source to make up for the shortfall in government grants. And why that's significant is that international students pay significantly more in tuition fees than domestic students. So this shows very conveniently the undergraduate tuition for domestic students versus international. And for our purposes, which we will be focusing on the University of Toronto, a domestic undergrad student pays approximately $6,000 per year to attend versus an international undergrad student that pays over nearly $60,000. And I want to note here that despite that they're paying so much in tuition, it's logical, but you shouldn't assume just because they can afford, $60,000 a year that they can afford $60,000 a year. The incomes and housing situations and just general, backgrounds of international students are so incredibly varied. So for the purposes of our findings, we will be focusing specifically on the University of Toronto. So when I mentioned earlier that international students populations have been increasing in most universities, this is the case at the University of Toronto. So you can see from this diagram that, from this graph that the international student population at the University of Toronto has been increasing over the last 10 years. But if we disaggregate the data, you can see that all new increases have been mostly driven by students from the People's Republic, Hong Kong and Taiwan, which has increased by over 700% since 2007. And in the 2014 U of T residents demand analysis, they attribute the crisis and shortage of on-campus student housing to the, quote, increased internationalization of the U of T student population. And also to put this further into perspective, there is approximately 45,000 undergraduate students currently enrolled at the University of Toronto throughout its 3 campuses. This graph shows that in 2019, there's just under 20,000 international students. And so international students make up a bulk of U of T's student population. So key findings, but before I go into that, I want to point to this picture on the right here, which is a postering campaign by Friends of Chinatown Toronto, and it reads, Chinatown was built by and for working class immigrants. And I think that really sets the scene as to how local activists and even community members see as who are the rightful users of this space, who should have rights over this space. So our first finding is that while traditional and new forms of studentification are occurring concurrently, actually, in Chinatown. So these 2 graphs are visualizations of survey responses from your Chinatown TO, and it shows the kind of range and diversity of housing types and how much money students are paying per month for their housing. And it's incredibly varied, with students living in super high-rise spaces to detached homes and paying anywhere from less than $600 to $2,800 and up. This image shows a rooming house in the Chinatown residential study area. And the ad here says that it has a single occupancy room for rent. And these types of spaces are very common throughout the space. And it kind of shows the types of small landlords that operate within the area. But what's really interesting is that when we're talking about increased residential development catering to students, developers and landlords are actively capitalizing on the high and unmet demand of housing for students. And there's, from this quote here, there's an indication that there's a move away from traditional student-only dormitory style purpose-built student accommodations to multifamily residential rentals, so just apartment buildings that are coded with specific amenities, unit types, and unit mixes to denote their preferred residence. So things like study rooms, as well as a higher ratio of studios, for example, as characterizing this building is targeting primarily students. And this quote is from an industry professional with 12 years of experience and 8 student housing projects completed or ongoing as of 2021. These two graphs show the proportion of projects by tenure types and by stories within the residential study area. This is data sourced from the City of Toronto City Planning. And you can see that in 2016 to 2020, majority of new projects proposed in the area are proposed to be rentals. But if we disaggregate the data, you can see that actually it's majority low-rise rental properties showing the horizontal first wave, as well as a number of mid-rise and high-rise projects. But you also have to keep in mind that these projects have significantly more units for students. So it really shows that these two forms are happening at the same time, and that there's a positive correlation between increases in student enrollment and housing construction. Our second finding, which is really interesting to me, is that commercial uses are catering increasingly to younger lifestyles. So this is a graph showing the number of establishments within the commercial study area by use, with blue noted in 2019 uses in blue and 2009 uses noted in blue and 2019 uses noted in red. And you can see that there was a decrease in retailers and wholesalers, which is significant again because of the area's history as part of the garment district, as well as increases in restaurants and bars and cafes and bakeries. But this graph doesn't show the whole story. If we disaggregate the data by commercial streets, looking specifically at Spadina Avenue here in 2009, you can see that, again, retailers and wholesalers are the predominant use within the strip. But interestingly enough, most of it was characterized by what we call local or just single establishment commercial uses, with very few international chains and Canadian chains. But when we look at the landscape in 2019, you can see that actually there's been a significant increase in international Chinese chains, international chains, and other Canadian chains in this space. But what's even more interesting is that for cafes and bakeries, all new increases have been driven mostly by international Chinese chains, specifically bubble tea franchises and chains. So what is bubble tea? Bubble tea is shown on the left here. Bubble tea, or boba as it's known on the West Coast, is connection to China's middle class and soft power is not well documented in academic scholarship. However, recent news media have made the connection to bubble tea as linked to the economic and cultural power of East Asia, as well as East Asia's influence on urban culture and the global circulation of taste. So for those of you who are not familiar with bubble tea, it's like tea with milk, and it has like these tapioca bubbles in it. That's quite nice. And this image is of a bubble tea at Xingfutang, which has recently been reviewed by Eater as like the Hermes of bubble tea. So, take that as you will. And in the article by the People's Daily, statistics collected by the People's Republic of China's government indicated that people between the ages of 16 and 35 account to over 90% of new style, i.e. bubble tea or boba, tea consumers in China. And I don't think it's a coincidence that as these young people enter foreign universities, their lifestyles and food preferences follow them. And what we see here on the right is actually a restaurant that caters specifically to regional palates. It's Ching's Garden. It's at Spadina and College, and it's been around in the Wuxi area of China since 1751. So how is that obviously not a chain? I don't know. It baffles me. So our third finding, well, considering all of these new residential and commercial changes, obviously it results in tensions and controversies relating to students and specifically fears over student densities. So this quote is from a resident who lives within the area and is part of the Grange Community Association, who noted that there's over 300 illegal rooming houses with 12 to 20 students each, and they remove viable rental spaces for other potential residents of the area, and there's not much stopping you from subdividing your house to cater to students. But I think also what's interesting is that there is a co-ethnic class-based tension happening as well. So this is a quote from a community member that is Chinese, and they note that there's a big class divide because, again, it's not cheap to become an international student. And they see all these students walking around draped in Gucci, and they're like, you don't care about the veggie grannies who are elderly Asian women who sell their produce and home-cooked goods along the strip. And regardless of these class-based tensions as true or not, i.e. whether or not these students are actually higher class or not, I don't think that's the point here. I think it's that there's a perception of them as being of a gentrifying class, regardless of whatever lived reality that they actually inhabit. And this leads us to our fourth finding, which is, well, all of this really puts us at a conundrum, and specifically like contested views over exactly who and what the future of Chinatown ought and should be. So across our interviews, we found that affordability is key to the future of Chinatowns, and this has been reiterated many ways. However, when we look at different populations, so this is a quote from an international Chinese student, they mentioned that, well, when a COCO, which is an international Chinese bubble tea chain, takes down another old business, they see this as a function of market forces. There's supply and demand here. There are many international students from China who goes to U of T for school. So it's a business opportunity. And that's how things will go because international students from China, they love COCO better than other establishments here. And that's just how the business works. And I think that brings a really interesting point here, right? Because, international Chinese students, they're new immigrants and they're racialized people by definition. And because of their sheer population adjacent to the space and their specific needs, lifestyle preferences, are they, as Chinese people, not allowed to shape the commercial needs, commercial uses within a space called Chinatown? And the fact that there's even a question about this just makes you think that, well, actually, just because you're Chinese, you're not actually owed a piece of the space. And this kind of sentiment is echoed by members of the business community as well, and people of the older generation who've seen the evolution and decline of Chinatown West. So this is a quote from Arlene Chan. She is the daughter of Jing, who was the head of the Save the Chinatown Committee in the 1960s. And she noted that she doesn't really have an issue if it's a big chain. For her, they just see this as another Chinese business. It caters and it broadens the range of choices to eat and spend your time in Chinatown. This is a quote from Tony Louis on behalf of the Chinatown Business Association. And he noted that gentrification is a good thing because new shops are coming in. And as you know, the population is growing older. And a lot of these earlier businesses, the people are retiring. So we need some new ideas and operators. And I think both Chan and Louis' perspective is valid if you consider, Chinatown as a space for the Chinese diaspora to come. And it's a space for it to continue is important to them. Specifically, I think because they've seen the decline, the tensions throughout the years. Which again brings us back to the question of bubble tea and regional Chinese chains, right? So, we have this really funny kind of paradox in which Chinatown is becoming more Chinese, i.e. more authentic to the lifestyles, tastes, preferences, as well as regional cuisines of China. But at the same time, it's becoming less Chinese, so less diasporic Chinese, less connected to this earlier history of Chinatowns as connected to the railway, as well as connected to the immigration policies within the states. And I also want to note that despite, maybe these as catering to younger lifestyles and preferences, they're not like cheap. The bubble tea you see on the left costs about $7. And one person I encountered at a bakery noted that for the price of one bubble tea, they can buy their whole dinner at a bakery. And the issue of affordability is important, especially as the area is again adjacent to Alexandra Park, a major social housing complex. And there's a highly visible senior population that use this space. So, it's a little bit more complicated, I guess, to really balance out the needs of existing and new residents. And ultimately, that brings us to the question, well, all of these new uses, are they really gentrification and displacement? And this person's perspective, I think, sums it up really well. They noted that one of the things about Chinatown is that it's a hedge for a lot of people from different parts of the city against poverty. They talked about how their friend comes to Chinatown for their produce, and the prices here is the difference between them living below and just above the poverty line. And for Friends of Chinatown, who are local activists, this person continues, they were mostly Asian students or artists who came to Chinatown to make use of its affordable artist studios and spaces. And they sort of came here, thinking that like by way of their like ethnic identity and their connection to this space, this is going to be the last place they would be displaced from, but only to find themselves being displaced by other Chinese people perceived of a higher class. And it really, again, emphasizes the trickiness of this whole thing between new and existing diaspora communities. And all of that is great, but I want to go back to the construction of an authentic Chinatown, which is the purpose of this whole presentation, is that everything that came before is just another narrative that I'm constructing, and I'm trying to convince you here. And I want you to really problematize how I'm presenting some of the things I'm saying, because what exactly is an authentic Chinatown? And I think that's relative to whatever positionality you occupy. Is it authentic to China? Is it authentic to the business class? Or is it authentic to the users, even if it includes students? And this shows the kind of competing claims over the space. However you want to define authenticity gives you legitimacy over how you want to shape future narratives that govern the development of the space. So some historic examples. So this is showing how community leaders saw Chinatown in the 1960s. So I want to argue that, well, Chinatown was built by and really for the needs of capital on the exploitation of working class people. The earlier narrative of Save the Chinatown in the 1960s, I don't think was driven by any needs and concerns over the senior population, particularly entirely that lives in this area, but really on the needs of the business community. So the first quote is by Zheng, who saw Chinatown as a space for belonging, but it's also a space prior to assimilation into the wider Canadian public. The second point is from Harry Lim, who was the proprietor of Lychee Restaurant, which is a major institution in the first Chinatown, who noted that a Chinatown shouldn't be a place for people to live. You should think of it as a modern shopping center, being able to buy and get everything in one stop. And also, I don't think it's a coincidence that the first Save the Chinatown movement was organized by and dominated by a collective that owned over 60% of all properties within the space. This is a quote about the rezoning of Spadina in the 1970s. So what happened here was that they wanted to rezone Spadina to support its existing industrial uses. However, the business community pushed back, saying that there was not enough consultation and that the proposed rezoning would actually hurt Chinatown's future development. And this was a quote from letters to the editors in response. And they wrote, "The Chinatown development speculators are shaping up their onslaught as an ethnic Chinese against City Hall campaign. They're trying to look like the spokesman for the whole Chinese Chinese community, nothing can be further from the truth. They represent nothing but their own vested interests. And I think that's really important to note. Who exactly is speaking, who is the loudest in the room, whatever they're saying is really just representative of their own vested interests. And what does that mean for students then? Well, students, I think, are the convenient, students and young people in general, I guess, are like really convenient scapegoats for a series of system failures that we just like to blame it on young people, right? Like, why can't young people buy houses because they bought too many lattes, that kind of thing, instead of, reforms to housing policy from the 80s and all of that. That's too complicated. So, I think the kind of convenient scapegoating of students and perceived ideas about what students want and what students need justify the kind of inhumane living conditions we subject them to. So on the left here is a recent news article of a billionaire, Charles Munger, who defends his design of windowless dorm rooms for University of California, Santa Barbara students. And he said that artificial windows in these like dorm rooms are actually better than the real deal windows because students like small spaces, and that they would prefer to have a small space with no windows than like a room shared with other people, but with windows, I guess. And this is completely unrelated to Campus One, which is shown on the image on the right here. So Campus One was a recent student housing development that's affiliated with the University of Toronto, but not a University of Toronto initiated student housing project. And despite questions over design, masking, and scale, I think what's really interesting about this specific project is how presumptions, again, of what students like, what students prefer, dictate the specific uses that occur within the space. So within this development, one bedroom, like just a bedroom in a 4-bedroom unit, costs $1,400. And, regardless of kind of, presumption of whether students have parents to support them or whatever, that's still a lot of money to charge like people between ages of 19 and 21, right? But also it's this like narrative of transiency that I'll show shortly after, or presumption of what students like or need that often enables their dehumanization and exploitation within the housing system. So this is a letter from the Grange, from a member of the Grange Community Association. They utilize their positionality. Their parents arrived in Canada in the early 1950s, and they're Chinese, and they live on the street to further dehumanize and kind of create this narrative around students. So the quote here under personal safety reads, "Many of the current residents are seniors who are very concerned about the influx of young people on our street. They're concerned about personal safety from young people who have no emotional ties to this neighborhood. And we believe that this many people may bring an element of danger to current residents, and that it'll be hard to know 800 or more transient students." And this letter goes on to talk about students and smoking, students and parking, students and noise, all of that. But what's really missing here is like how students actually see the space and how they interact with it, but also like if there's even a discrepancy to how students are perceived versus how they actually are within this specific complex. And I think it's really hypocritical to mobilize on points like this, because if we recall the language of that dictated or surrounded the Chinese in the first 100 years in this country, how are we not seeing the same narratives and talking points mobilized by residents to justify the dehumanization of this group of people? And they are like people in a specific period within their lives, right? So recall that they're only here to earn money and return to their country later, or that they are visitors to this space, they're guests, and how many of these are dens and have throngs of students occupying this space and denoting, kind of hinting at the devices happening behind closed doors. So I don't know, I think it's I do think it's a little hypocritical, right? Especially for a community that, prides itself as overcoming this history of oppression from the Canadian state to turn around and mobilize on the exact same talking points on another group of people. And so to conclude, neighborhood change in Chinatown is tied to universities, resulting in both horizontal and vertical studentifications, as I've shown earlier. As well, we want to contribute the term co-ethnic studentification to show the class-based tensions that can be overlooked under assumptions of shared ethnicity and homogeneity. We also note that despite fears and realities of displacement, new developments in Chinatown is mostly multifamily rental and social housing units, which breaks away from the predominant city trends of luxury condominium developments and even adding to the much needed affordable and social housing stocks. And fourth, I'm trying to show that, well, Chinatown has always been contested and it's always been a constructed place that's continuously reinforced by members of the community over its construction, how it's presented. So, how the narrative surrounding this space is contributing to the construction of this space, but also how that's almost in a way separate from the realities within the space. And finally, to put it in the broader context, ethnic neighborhoods exist in other global cities such as Toronto, and they're always over contestation of its presentation and corresponding strategies of survival. And we need to be critical of how they're packaged or marketed to attract investment in people. And I guess you can broaden this point to other practitioners as well. When you're doing community consultation or trying to understand the history of a specific community, you should consult a wide range of sources and not just default to the convenient community leaders who pose themselves as experts over the space but represent nothing but their own vested interests. And finally, in this context, studentification creates a polarizing debate over the future of Chinatown and discourses of authenticity. Who should Chinatown be for? And really circling back to the question, just because if you're Chinese, are you owed a piece of the space?